I want to go back now to the prediction that you made 10 years ago. This is our guest, John Mearsheimer, speaking in 2015 about the war in Ukraine.
But I actually think that what's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. And I believe that the policy that I'm advocating, which is neutralizing Ukraine and then building it up economically and getting it out of the competition between Russia on one side and NATO on the other side, is the best thing that could happen to the Ukrainians. What we're doing is encouraging the Ukrainians to play tough with the Russians. We're encouraging the Ukrainians to think that they will ultimately become part of the West, because we will ultimately defeat Putin and we will ultimately get our way. Time is on our side. And of course, the Ukrainians are playing along with this. And the Ukrainians are almost completely unwilling to compromise with the Russians and instead want to pursue a hardline policy. Well, as I said to you before, if they do that, the end result is that their country is going to be wrecked. And what we're doing is, in effect, encouraging that outcome. I think it would make much more sense for us to work to create a neutral Ukraine. It would be in our interest to bury this crisis as quickly as possible. It certainly would be in Russia's interest to do so. And most importantly, it would be in Ukraine's interest to put an end to the crisis. Thank you.
So that's our guest, John Mearsheimer, speaking in 2015. That's a clip that's now been seen millions of times around the world because it was so prescient. I'm curious, Professor Mearsheimer, what would you say now to someone who sees that clip and says, well, you might say that this is happening now, but it wouldn't be if Trump simply wasn't walking away from Ukraine. This is Trump who's abandoning Ukraine. And if we just held out a little bit longer with some more weapons, we could turn the tide and Ukraine could regain all of its territory and kick out the Russians for good.
The Russians are winning on the battlefield. They've already conquered about 20% of Ukrainian territory. And if the war goes on, they will conquer more. They will take more oblasts than the 4 oblasts they've already taken. Furthermore, Ukraine is a red state. It's on life support. And there's no way the situation can be turned around. I don't know how these people can make the argument that Ukraine can rescue the situation with help from the West. First of all, the biggest problem the Ukrainians face now is a manpower shortage. They're greatly outnumbered, I would argue, by more than 2 to 1 on the front lines, and they can't cover the entire front. They're too spread out. So the Russians are finding places that they can penetrate along the Ukrainian front lines. They're just in real trouble, the Ukrainians, and they don't have the manpower. Furthermore, we don't have sufficient weaponry to give them to match the amount of weaponry that the Russians have. And this is especially true with regard to artillery. So the military balance has markedly shifted against Ukraine since 2022, when the war started. Remember, 2022 was a good year for the Ukrainians. But after that, the Russians began to mobilize in a serious way, and they are now on the march. There's just no question about that. And what are we going to do to rescue the situation? Nobody has an answer to that. And people who say that, Ukraine is holding the Russians off, and with just a little bit more aid, we can help the Ukrainians turn the tide and get back the territory they lost, are delusional. This is just nonsense. But you hear this kind of talk all the time in the West. And that's in large part because the discourse in the West, as you know well, Aaron, for a long time has been disconnected from reality.